Have you heard about the art forger who managed to outsmart Nazis, museums, and experts? It was the greatest art scam of the 20th century. How could some simple painter manage to fool the most powerful people connected to art, money, and status? Easy. Hans von Meegeren, the man you're seeing on the screen here, was not just a simple Dutch painter. His curse? Being born at the end of the 19th century. By the early 20th century, critics and museums were celebrating cubism, expressionism, abstraction, experimental forms and styles. Look at these examples of what critics were loving at the time. Von Meegeren, however, hated modern art. He believed it was ugly, unserious, and a betrayal of craftsmanship. He preferred old masters, careful realism, traditional religious and historical themes like these. This already put him at odds with critics. Even worse was what he thought of said critics, and the relationship he had with them. Early in his career, von Meegeren did exhibit and sell paintings, but reviews were lukewarm at best and often dismissive. Critics described his work as derivative, outdated, technically competent, but soulless. That last accusation cut especially deep. How could a gorgeous painting like this be called soulless? What made this worse is that he believed the critics were frauds themselves. In his mind, they praised modern art not because it was good, but because it was fashionable. They dismissed him not because he lacked talent, but because he didn't conform. Over time, this belief hardened into something close to paranoia. "If they say I have no soul," he reportedly said once, "I'll prove they can't even recognize one when it's right in front of them." How? He decided to expose the establishment by beating them at its own game. And whose work did he pick to pull off this master plan? It's likely you won't have even heard of him. But that's exactly why Johann Vermeer was the perfect pick for forgery. Vermeer's works were extremely rare. There were only 35 known pieces, including some you're seeing right now. What made it even more perfect was that there were huge gaps in his biography too, and experts assumed there had to be lost works. Here's where our friend von Meegeren steps in, because you guessed it, he made these lost works. He wasn't forging something that already existed. He was filling in the gaps with new pieces of work. Scholars were happy because they thought it proved their theory about lost work. Buyers were ecstatic because they could put their hands on something long thought gone forever. And von Meegeren was overjoyed because he was finally winning. This is the bit that really got me. Not only was von Meegeren clever enough to create these lost works, but he also created an entire lost phase just to really add some credibility into the mix. He claimed that there was an early missing religious phase in Vermeer's life. Scholars already believed that this was probable, so there was no resistance. After all, Vermeer didn't consistently sign or date his paintings. This already makes establishing a clear timeline difficult, but there's a much stranger reason for this belief. Vermeer's first securely attributed works already show confident composition, sophisticated use of light, and complex spatial structure. Look at these beauties. There is no obvious clumsy apprentice phase in his works. This raised an obvious question. Where did he learn to paint like this? Artists don't emerge fully formed. There had to be earlier work, but none was known. And this uncertainty became the perfect opportunity for our forger. Von Meegeren was simply agreeing with what had already been said. It was like slipping a fake photo into a half-empty family album, and that made him even more believable. His approach? Go big or go home. There was absolutely no point in doing it by halves. Everything had to be right. He understood enough about the industry to know that someone could spot even the smallest discrepancy. He couldn't paint with contemporary tools and pretend they were 300 years old. So he went out and found himself some real 17th century canvases. He ground his own pigments and mixed paint with bakelite resin. This process can be repeated today, but it was much harder back then without bagged pigments. Any clues as to why he would do that? Well, he baked his finished paintings in an oven to harden them, which created artificial cracking. Come on, that's pretty clever, right? You can see it now. Frustrated artist, a clever plan, and the smile that came across his face every time he pulled a piece from the oven. So the pieces were made. The next test was getting them past an expert. And this is arguably the trickiest point. It's also the part that was likely to fail. In steps Abraham Bredius, the world's leading Vermeer expert. He was so good at what he did that he was nicknamed the Pope of Vermeer. This is a person who should have been able to spot a forgery a mile away. One piece that von Meegeren created was called the Supper at Emmaus. The art world was literally holding its breath at this point. If someone with Bredius's credentials said the painting was a genuine Vermeer piece, then it had to be true. So imagine the elation when he came out and publicly called the Supper at Emmaus the masterpiece of Johann Vermeer of Delft, with a long article praising the author. Once he believed it, everyone else relaxed, including von Meegeren. Think about how much he must have been laughing at this point. What I find truly fascinating about this story isn't just that von Meegeren was brilliant, but that the experts were predictable. Scholars already believed Vermeer had missing works and possibly an early religious phase, so von Meegeren wasn't challenging their ideas. He was confirming them. This is classic confirmation bias. Add to that authority bias. Once Abraham Bredius declared a painting authentic, questioning it became professionally risky. Disagreeing didn't just mean challenging a painting, it meant challenging the Pope of Vermeer, the museum that displayed it, and the collectors who had invested their reputations. At that point, skepticism wasn't intellectual honesty, it was social suicide. It's important to note that von Meegeren's paintings don't fool modern experts at all. To contemporary eyes, they look heavy, awkward, and nothing like Vermeer's subtle handling of light. Can you spot the differences in these paintings? But that's the point. Experts in the early 20th century weren't looking at Vermeer the way we do now. Their understanding of his style was incomplete, shaped by scarcity and theory rather than comparison. They were expecting something different, something earlier, rougher, more religious. Von Meegeren didn't create perfect Vermeers. He created exactly the Vermeers scholars were hoping to find. The forgery had passed the ultimate test. The world's leading expert believed the story, and that went a long way to convincing everyone else. Now, von Meegeren needs a buyer. There was absolutely no point in going all in on this scam if he couldn't find a buyer. He'd fooled the experts, but he still had a point to prove. Willem van der Vorm was a wealthy Dutch shipping magnate, the kind of man you imagine buying rare and expensive art. He does look the part, doesn't he? So he snapped a Supper at Emmaus right up and paid a record-breaking price for it as well. But sit yourself down here, because van der Vorm didn't hang the painting in his house when he'd paid all that money for it. Any guesses as to what he did? He donated it to a museum. You heard me, he paid an obscene amount of money and then gave the painting away. Now, I'll forgive you for thinking he was stupid, but there was method in his madness, and this move benefited von Meegeren too. Donating the painting elevated the museum's status and elevated van der Vorm's status as a benefactor. It tied his name permanently to what he believed was a Vermeer painting. In other words, he was saying, "This is proof that I belong in this cultural lineage." And that bought him a ticket into every exclusive room at the time. So how exactly did this benefit von Meegeren? Well, by this point, he wasn't just tricking one man. He'd created a chain reaction that he could exploit. If anyone challenged the painting now, they were also challenging an expert, a buyer, and a museum. But he still wasn't done. See the gentleman on the screen? Andrew Mellon was an American billionaire and one of the most powerful art collectors in the world. So when he purchased von Meegeren Vermeer, it gave the forgery legitimacy. No one was going to go up against such powerful people now. Von Meegeren had successfully fooled some of the most powerful and wealthiest people in the art world. No one wanted to be skeptical, and luckily for him, there was no modern forensic tests to prove that the paintings were fake. But what von Meegeren wasn't expecting was his clever forgery to attract the attention of the Nazis. You know that top-level Nazis positioned themselves as purveyors of the finer things in life, and more often than not, that meant expensive pieces of art. Hermann Göring was obsessed with art and desperately wanted a Vermeer for his private collection. You're going to love this because Göring once traded 137 stolen pieces of art for one von Meegeren forgery. The irony in that is just too fantastic for me not to laugh at it. One fake painting saved 137 real ones. But all good things must come to an end, and von Meegeren's time was limited. Drawing the attention of Göring was his ultimate downfall. After World War II, he was arrested and charged with selling Dutch cultural property to Nazis. But he had a defense, and do you want to know what he said? "I forged it myself." Yep, that's right, he came straight out with it. Being a criminal became his alibi. I told you this was a good story. Experts didn't believe him, though. The Vermeer forgeries were that good. It was only when he painted a new Vermeer under guard using the same methods and getting the same results that authorities accepted the truth. Can you imagine what a day in court would have looked like that day? People would have literally been watching paint dry. In the end, von Meegeren was convicted of forgery, not treason, and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Unfortunately, he died of a heart attack only 2 months into his sentence, though. But if all of that seemed wild, wait until you hear this. Von Meegeren became somewhat of a folk hero. His forgeries went on to be forged, including by his own son. Jacques von Meegeren produced fake Vermeers that were already known to be fake and sold them as lost or undiscovered von Meegeren works. He too was convicted of forgery, but never reached his father's hero status. After all, there can only be one master forger, and Han was the real deal. Han von Meegeren created the most perfect scam, finally got his work recognized, even though it wasn't under his name, and created a story so great, even his own flesh and blood tried to emulate it. If you're going to pull off such a crime, that's exactly how to do it.